Greetings, ladies, gents, and someday, hopefully, Steph too. Last time, I'm willing to admit, I was a bit crass. I mean, even the greatest make mistakes, and make no mistake, Steph is the greatest. Perhaps I got a little carried away with making fun of him for that one, or several, mistakes he made. So, although I said I was going to go through the rest of Steph's bad examples of bad deductive reasoning, clearly that would just be me reveling in the one and only failure of a man far greater than myself, in a vain attempt at hiding my own philosophical insecurities. Also, it would be quite lengthy and probably boring to those not fluent in logispeak. Now, if you disagree and want to see that video, let me know and I will make it eventually. But for now, we're going to read on. There's still so much wisdom Steph has to impart. Having almost successfully described the realm of deductive reasoning in the last episode, Steph today concerns himself with the rest of reason, starting with tautologies and ending today at induction. First on today's agenda is the notion of synonymy, or as Steph calls it, synonym logic. Well, what the hell does that mean? Basically, synonymy has to do with sameness of meaning. And that bears on discussion of truth because assuming two words or sentences have the same meaning, they will be substitutable in most contexts without risking change of truth value. Truths of this sort appear to hold in virtue of meaning alone. Kant would call these analytic truths, and tautologies is not inappropriate. Now, philosophers have probably spilled enough ink to fill an ocean on this one. So I'm not sure it can be briefly covered, and I'm less sure that it should be. So I won't, for now anyway. Fortunately for us, Steph's only aims are to introduce the notion and illustrate its potential abuse. Both of which, as you'd expect, our king does effortlessly, all while managing to support his political views at the same time. Steph's problem with synonymy is displayed in a bunch of examples throughout this section, where basically he accuses opponents of smudging terms to win arguments.
In the realm of political debate, the word education generally turns out to mean coercively funded government schools, which is not the same thing at all, since education takes many forms.
So when Molyneux says he's against state education, it would be wrong to think that implies he's against all education. However, in this case, and the other cases considered, for example, foreign aid, I think the opponent's next question will be, well, what about the poor? Which, in credit to Molyneux, he does predict.
In the same way, foreign aid generally gets defined as the only possible way to help poor and innocent people in other countries avoid dying from hunger, which pulls the neat linguistic trick of allowing you to accuse anyone skeptical of the value and virtue of foreign aid to be in favor of the innocent starving to death.
But the thing is, you may not say you're against education or aid for the poor, but you are against the only current method of doing so, and you aren't offering any practical alternatives which could be implemented today. It's not because they think only the state can educate people or save the poor. It's just the state does that now, and most of us think it's kind of important that something does, especially the povs. So when you denounce the thing currently providing that service without providing empirically tested alternatives, people are going to be wary. I don't think this means they're trying to pull some linguistic trick. They're just wondering what your alternative is. And since most leftist scum aren't in favour of a Hobbesian war of all against all, pussies, they don't accept your alternative. So when you say, just because I don't approve of the state educating the poor, doesn't mean I don't approve of educating the poor. Now that's true, but the leftist wants to know, well, how do you think it should be done? And when you answer with free markets, I think it's perfectly reasonable to be somewhat apprehensive. That's because this answer offers little practical comfort to anyone in that position who doesn't happen to be a neoliberal. Now, the leftists' problem with this then is that Yeah, the state does many things, and yeah, I'm sure lots of them are awful. I'm equally sure they also provide needed services to, well, those in need. Donate here if you want to minimise the state's role in reducing Irish poverty. The supporters of Steph probably just think I'm talking a load of bollocks here. All we have to do to find out what Steph thinks we should do with the poor is ask UPB. Oh, great and powerful UPB. Tell us what we should do about the poor. Oh yes, it's all becoming clear to me now. If you think about it, no one wants to be poor, right? It is universally preferred to not be poor. But that means, if you are poor, you want not to be. To want not to be is to want not to exist. Therefore, poor people must, essentially, not want to exist. I think we could all agree further that euthanasia is morally permissible, at least if it is truly desired by a person. Not out of some fleeting doubts or fits of depression, but if it concerned their very essence, of course it would be permissible. Therefore, we must kill the poor. Moreover, since there is no vital distinction between killing and letting die, the most effective way to do this is removing the source of their education, finance, and health. That most treacherous leviathan, the state. Or that's what I reckon Steph would say about the poor to the liberals in his head, at any rate. Finally, one other problem with Steph's interpretation of synonymy is when he says stuff like,
The phrase unmarried man is merely the definition of the word bachelor, and synonyms do not add much to human knowledge.
Which isn't necessarily true. Here's Frege's famous counterexample. The morning star is the evening star. We know now that this is true. They are in fact the same star. However, people once thought that they were two different stars, and discovering they were the same was no trivial matter of looking in a dictionary. Empirical research and evidence was needed before this synonymy could ever be attested by dictionaries. So it seems not all identity statements are uninformative in the way that we might think all unmarried men are unmarried men is. Cases like Frege's show that we can have informative synonymies. Well, let's leave synonymy to one side. In the next section, and, well, many to follow, Steph gets overly defensive about the whole correlation is not equal to causation thing. Now, people who hear this phrase often tend to be either college undergrads or people misunderstanding the difference. I wonder which one better describes Steph. So why is it so important that we understand this mistake? Well, because Steph's about to go make a bunch of generalizations on some correlations he's been observing. Generalizations like
1. Atheists tend to be leftists. 2. In a democracy, people tend to vote according to their political beliefs. 3. Therefore, in a democracy, as atheism tends to increase, leftist policies tend to increase.
And he suggests a rather illuminating causal mechanism that might underlie this correlation.
Atheism may be promoted by those wanting to increase state power, since it removes the obstacle of Christianity. One example of this would be communism.
So, you see, Christianity may be promoted by those wanting to decrease state power. Did I say Christianity? Sorry, I meant atheism. I can't imagine what would have put that idea into my head.
See, even Stefan Molyneux praises Christian culture, even though he's not Christian, because he is...
Never mind that. What do any of these correlations have to do with, well, anything? You see, it turns out the Christian audience is full of exploitable right-wingers. And in order to suckle at this bountiful tea, Steph now needs to downplay his noted atheism without actually revoking it. In all seriousness, I tip my hat to this. It was only after reading this section that I finally realised what Molly was up to with the Christians. I was genuinely starting to think he was just desperate for viewers. That long, meek conversation with Prager. But really, Steph just remembered his Nietzsche. You see, contrary to popular belief, Nietzsche didn't hate Christians. He thought their herd-like mentality was a blessing. So you see, what our benevolent king has done here is to actually enact Nietzschean policy on a somewhat large scale, and to great effect, I might add. So, I mean, if you're a Christian fan of Steph, I'm afraid you've been had. If you're a fan of Nietzsche, on the other hand, I'd start taking notes. Right, back now to our loftier logical notions. And tasked with explaining the difference between truth and validity, how do you expect Mr. Molyneux would proceed? If you said, with an analogy, you'd be half right. It's two analogies. The argument, you see, is a lot like a car factory. Or maybe a statue casting shadows. I'd love to see Steph's argument factory. At any rate, I trust these analogies have more than cleared up any confusion you may have had over the difference between truth and validity. And since nothing goes majorly wrong in this section, apart from the sex analogy at the end,
the conclusion is the juiciest part of the argument, philosophy's money shot, so to speak.
But the less said about that, the better. We'll move on. Now here Steph finally begins explaining the differences between induction and deduction. That, or the difference between lions and zebras. Like a true king, Steph says all he needs to about induction eloquently in the first 3 sentences, and only then proceeds to semi-coherently ramble for some time. If you'd like to learn more about induction and what real philosophers, I mean state-funded philosophers, have to say about it, I refer you back to the boys at Stanford. The other distinguishing characteristic Steph seems to be driving at is that deductive reasoning is predatory?
Deductive reasoning goes from the general to the specific, because that is what predators do.
Now this seemed strange to me at first, but then I recalled Wittgenstein once famously said something about not knowing shit about lines.
If a lion could speak, we would not be able to understand what he said.
That's when the philosophical significance of what was happening first struck me. Once again in this section, Steph raises his middle finger to both Wittgenstein and philosophy in general by describing the world a line inhabits, and in propositional form no less, using his patented quasi-Aristotelian logic. So prepare yourselves to experience what it's like to be a logical line.
1. I am hungry. 2. My hunger is satisfied with meat. 3. All zebras are made of meat. 4. The slowest zebras are the easiest to catch. 5. I will stalk and chase the slowest zebra. 6. This zebra is the slowest zebra. I will stalk and chase this one. You see how this works?
From his phenomenological investigations into the essence of lionhood, Steph realizes
inductive reasoning is prey-based, or beta.
This would explain the resentment scientists hold towards philosophy. Of course, only betas need evidence to argue, which leads us to one inevitable conclusion, or money shot, as it were, which is that relativists, scientists, and other fans of induction are all beta. Probably cooks too. I think that follows logically from being a beta. Right, we've learned quite a bit today about philosophy, Steph, and of course, lines. So maybe now is a good time for an intermission to let these, crazy, radical new ideas settle in the reader's mind. Do join us next time for our promised Clash of Titans, and to see who will face Kant inside the noumenal realm for the title King of Ethics.